that's been recombined from multiple other species. Once an organism has DNA from other species within it, we call that a transgenic organism. And this is what we started off the chapter talking about. This is the issue that's going on in Mexico. Some of the native corn species there, when we look at the DNA, are no longer just corn. They have bred with some of our genetically modified corn from the United States, and now we have some of these native corn species that are mixed. They're no longer native. They're no longer purebred. This is something we could go into great detail about of how you get a genetically modified organism, but I want you to look at the picture, and we're just going to do a really quick explanation of how we get this genetically modified organism. All of this started with E. coli bacteria, and bacteria DNA, you should hopefully remember from biology, is different than your DNA. Your DNA is, that twisted ladder, so your DNA looks like that twisted ladder shape. Bacteria don't have that twisted ladder shape of their DNA. They have something called a plasmid, and this right here is a picture of a plasmid. It's labeled in the picture. Write yourself a note that a plasmid is still just DNA, but instead of being in a twisted ladder shape, it's in a ring. So what a scientist does is they take a plasmid from a bacteria and they isolate a piece of DNA that they would want to inject into or put into another organism. Okay, and they put that plasmid into the desired target organism, and it actually gets taken up into the desired organism's DNA. Okay, so this little plasmid, this little piece, is going to be transferred into the plant that we want it to be transferred into. Any plant. We could do this with any organism. I could put this into any plant that I wanted to grow. And so this little red piece of DNA you see right here is eventually taken up by the plant's DNA. This is now a transgenic organism. It has recombinant or recombined DNA. As that cell divides, that little red piece of DNA is going to be in all of the cells. As the cell grows, it will be in all of the cells of the plant. Okay, so am I simplifying that a whole lot? Yeah, I am. But that's the idea I want you to have, that you take a small piece of bacterial DNA, you insert the gene that you're wishing to study or you're wishing to put into your plant, you insert it into the genome of the organism, you let it divide, you let it go through all the cells. Is this going on with our food supply right now? Yes. 85% of the corn you eat is GMO corn. 90% of the soy in the United States is GMO soy. What are we putting in there? We're putting in some genes for resistance to frost. We're putting in some genes to resistance from pests. We're putting in some genes that actually give you extra nutrients in some of your plants. So we are genetically modifying our food so we can have and grow and have more food for the planet. Remember, back in the very beginning of these notes, we had a list of the 5 things that we're doing to increase our food production. We're putting in more fossil fuels, we're making more irrigation, we're putting in more fertilizer, we're cultivating more land, but we're also developing more productive crops. And this slide here is what we're talking about. How do we make more productive crops? We genetically modify them. As always, there's going to be some benefits and some criticisms. One of the benefits that people say is that this is exactly the same as breeding. Some people say this is no different than breeding together 2 different breeds of dogs and coming up with a new dog breed. It's not hurting anything. It's still a dog. I can mix 2 breeds of corn together. It's still corn. And it's really nothing different than what we've been doing for thousands of years. We've been mixing and making all different types of organisms over time. This is not a big deal. Critics, though, say, and I want to circle here and point out that these 2 positions kind of are the exact opposite of each other. Critics say that this is very different because we are mixing genes from different species. Sure, we've always been doing this. We've been breeding plants to get bigger plants and better plants and different color flowers for thousands and thousands of years, but when we've done it in the past, we've only really mixed one species with others of the same species. We take a red rose and we cross it with a white rose to try to get a pink rose. Now we're putting genes from fish into corn and from bacteria into fish, and we are now mixing genes from different species. Going back to the benefits list, we can have an almost unlimited list of benefits from this genetic modification of organisms, because all we have to do is find a gene for what we want and put it in. We are able to add nutrients to crops. Almost all the corn, I'm sorry, not corn, almost all the rice that's grown in China now is called golden rice. Rice on its own doesn't actually have all the nutrients you need, but if we could add in some genes for different vitamins and nutrients, we can make that a much more productive crop to help people survive and not have malnutrition problems. Almost all the corn in our country is now called Roundup Ready corn. Roundup Ready corn is used to prevent pest damage. So Roundup is a kind of pesticide, and we can genetically modify our plants to be resistant to this pesticide. So I can put a ton of pesticide on my field, kill all the pests, prevent any little critters from chewing on my corn, and the corn isn't damaged at all because I've genetically modified it to be resistant to the pesticides. I can even genetically modify my plants to be resistant to droughts so I can water them less. So again, I'm using my technology. So some people see all these things as benefits. Now, looking at the list of criticisms, we obviously have the issue that's going on in Mexico. There's really no way to stop these genes from the genetically modified organisms from ending up in wild plants. The pollinators are out there. The pollinators are moving around. The wind is there. It's moving things around. If you're a farmer using genetically modified corn and your neighbor's not using genetically modified corn, there's really no way to stop a cross-contamination between those two fields. This also may become an issue with that evolutionary arms race that we talked about a few slides back. As we genetically modify our organisms, are the weeds and the insects and all the other pests going to end up becoming resistant? Is this going to accelerate that evolutionary arms race completely out of scale? And another criticism that's coming up is just really an ethical question. In Europe, there are laws banning the sale of genetically modified organisms, and it's a very different climate there than it is here. Many Europeans, I should say, not all, but many Europeans just say that they don't even want to eat these genetically modified organisms because they don't know what impact it could have on their health. Whereas in the United States, this is in almost every food you eat. I'm sure 90% of the food you've eaten today has come from genetically modified organisms, because we've done this with most of our crops, and it's just something that's accepted more here. Most people in Europe want us to follow what's called the precautionary principle, and the precautionary principle is very easy to understand. The precautionary principle says what people out there are saying is we need to stop genetically modifying organisms until we at least understand what we've done so far. Okay, let me repeat that. The precautionary principle says we need to stop genetically modifying organisms until we at least understand what we've done so far. Their claim is that we don't really understand the impact of what this is doing to the ecosystems and to our bodies and to other organisms. And until we understand that, we better not keep doing it. But again, this precautionary principle is really something we see more in the European markets. We really have not had any limitation of these GMOs in the United States. And the final ethical question is actually a Supreme Court case, Percy Schmeiser versus Monsanto. It really comes down to, when we're genetically modifying these, who owns the genetically modified genes? Nobody owns corn. Nobody has a patent on corn. But if I've genetically modified my corn, do I own a patent on that? Do I own that corn? One big company that we'll see in a video that we're going to watch, Monsanto, they seem to think that they own the Roundup Ready corn. They own these genetically modified strains of corn. And they actually go around from farm to farm and make sure that if you have that GMO corn, you paid them for it every single year. You can't save your seeds and replant them. If you want to grow that corn, you have to buy new seeds from them every year. And what happened in, I believe in Iowa, to this man named Percy Schmeiser is he claimed that he was just growing regular non-modified corn. Monsanto came around, did some testing, and found that genetically modified corn was growing in his fields. And his response was, look, I didn't grow this corn. It must have been cross-contaminated from my neighbor's field. I didn't do anything. I grow my corn, I save my seed every year, and I plant it the next year. I can't stop the genetically modified corn from my neighbor's field getting into mine. And Monsanto wanted to sue them because Monsanto said this is a patent infringement. This is infringement on our legal rights. And it ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 2008, what finally happened was Monsanto had to pay to clean up the whole problem. Basically, Monsanto went in and took all this man's crop, took over this man's farm, and ended up that they had the legal rights to this type of corn. So you can see there's a lot of criticisms, ethical issues, but at the same time, a lot of benefits that can come from these genetically modified organisms. Remember here when you're studying, make yourself one final note. This isn't really, at least in the United States, an issue that we should be debating of should we do this or should we not do this. We're already all in on this. 85% of our corn crops are GMOs, 90% of our soy crops are GMOs. Really the issue has to become, how much more should we do? Is there an impact from this? Do we have to worry about some of these ethical questions? Because there's really no going back. Virtually all of our crops at this point in the United States are GMOs. Well, with all this happening, we do need to be concerned about preserving the diversity of our crops and not letting all of the different strains start to interbreed, because we do want to keep our biodiversity high. In the next chapter, in chapter 11, we're going to look at why we want to keep biodiversity high, but biodiversity is definitely it's being threatened. It's a danger from these GMOs. If you go into Mexico and you do studies, what they found is that only 30% of the varietals of corn, of the different species of corn that existed in 1930 still exist today. Corn, if you look at this picture down here, I always love showing people this because they're always surprised. This picture on the left here, this is what actual native corn looks like. If you were alive 2,000 years ago and you were just at the start of when we started to leave hunting gathering as humans and become farmers, this is what your corn would have looked like. Look at the scale with the quarter. Corn only had a few kernels in it. It was a very small plant. And obviously we all know what modern corn looks like. This has come about because we've genetically bred the corn over time. Remember on the last slide, this idea here, some people say that this GMO is very similar to what we've always been doing. We've been breeding corn for thousands and thousands of years. The difference is now we're putting in bacteria DNA into corn. We're not just swapping corn for corn. Anyway, we are definitely losing the biodiversity of our crop. We only have 30% of the corn varietals in Mexico that we had about 100 years ago. This is a big deal. If we have fewer and fewer species, they're really not going to be able to survive droughts or survive different problems. In the year 2000, there was a big threat to the banana crop. Unlike corn that has hundreds of varieties, there is only one variety of banana, just one. And in 2000, there was a huge crop failure of banana. And I remember they were doing fundraisers to raise money to send down to the countries that were growing bananas to try to save the banana crop, because it really was that close to almost wiping out our supply of bananas that year. We don't want to see all of the different species that we grow getting to that point. We don't want to end up with only one species of corn left because they've all mixed together. In order to preserve our crop diversity, what we've done is created what are called seed banks. Seed banks are exactly what they sound like. They are vaults in protected areas where we collect all the different seeds in the world and keep them separate so that we have something we can go back to. That if in our fields these corns are all starting to intermix, at least we can go back to the seed bank and know we have those original varieties of the plants. How many are there? There's about 1,400 seed banks in the world right now, and they are actually protecting 1 to 2 million different seeds. So there is a lot of diversity that we're trying to protect. I've listed some of the names of the most common seed banks just to be familiar with them in case they come up on something. Royal Botanic Gardens in England. US has our National Seed Storage Laboratory that's in New York. There's a Seed Saver in Iowa that keeps all the different types of plants. Mexico, we read about this at the start of our chapter. They have the wheat and corn improvement center. The one that's probably the most famous seed bank is in Sweden. It's called the Doomsday Seed Vault. And there's a little cartoon here about, I'm sorry, in Norway, not in Sweden. A little cartoon here about it. It's actually set in the side of a glacier in Norway, and it is said